There's a debate about how much information about space capabilities should stay classified and how much the U.S. should reveal. Overclassification of space systems undermines the Pentagon's ability to combat risks of mission failure during a crisis. That's according to Chris Stone. He's Senior Fellow for Space Studies for the Mitchell Institute's Spacepower Advantage Research Center. Welcome to the program.
Thank you.
So explain, because you had said that there's a link between classification and deterrence.
Mm-hmm.
What is that link?
Well, there are three main components of deterrence. There is a capability or a weapon system that you create a threat with. You have the willingness to use that threat, and then you have the ability to communicate that threat to an adversary. And with overclassification in the space world, you have a situation where most of our stuff is so highly classified that we're not even allowed to talk about it amongst ourselves if you're not cleared into it, if you're not read into it. And so if you can't talk about it amongst yourselves, you clearly can't tell your adversary that you have it. So it makes it very difficult for you to have any sort of deterrence on space attack if you can't say we have Project X that can do X, Y, and Z if you attack us.
But isn't it a good thing to classify information because we're trying to keep our capabilities and our technology away from our adversary?
Absolutely. It's not classification that is bad. Classification is good. You need certain levels of classification depending on the sensitive information and how much damage could be done to the country if it were to be leaked to the adversary. What we're talking about is when you have a classified system that is so classified that you can't even talk about it amongst yourself. So here's an example. In the air domain, we have the B-21 bomber. Everyone knows there's a B-21 bomber, and that's a long-range strike weapon in the air domain. But we don't know necessarily what it looks like necessarily, how it flies, what its components are, what kind of weapons it carries. But we know it's a long-range strike bomber, so you can talk about it. In the space domain, we don't even have that kind of information that we can share with the adversary. We just say we have stuff, and having stuff is not necessarily a credible threat in the minds of our adversaries.
And it would also be linked to funding, because if you can't really talk openly about, hey, this is what we need and this is how much it costs, you know, you can't just say, trust me, we need it.
Right, and that's another problem, as you mentioned. In the process, the Space Force has to articulate, because everybody has to argue for their piece of the defense budget. And if all you're doing in a defense budget meeting is saying, as you say, trust me, we have something, this is important, it's very difficult for you to win over people who aren't cleared into the program that your program is credible enough to move up the priority chain.
So who decides what gets classified, what gets declassified? What's that process?
It's a very complicated process. There are several layers of classification authorities and declassification authorities within the Department of Defense, from the President on down. And usually the process entails a bunch of coordination of people who have equity in that specific information being outed or not outed. Sometimes a senior leader can say, enough is enough, we're just going to open up this information to the public or to our allies at a certain situation like that. But it's complicated, and so...
I mean, can he or she just say that and declassify something?
The President has the authority to do that.
But nobody else below that?
There are declassification authorities below that, but you have to coordinate it amongst people with equities, otherwise people will get upset because there's a lot of different interrelations with programs that you may release information on one program that might give information about another program, so you got to be very careful with how you declassify to make sure that you don't cause any problems with other issues that you want to keep secret.
Sure. So are you recommending that we change that process, or do we just simply speed up the declassification process?
I think it would be good if there was a way to speed up the declassification process. So for example, if it's a program like in the space program where you have to have a credible deterrent with, that should be something that moves to the head of the line a little bit faster than, say, something that you want to keep secret and people are just talking about opening it up more. But yeah, speed is the key, especially if the Space Force wants to be credible as a deterrent force. They have to have the ability to communicate about their things.
So do you think that this is a problem specific to the Space Force, or do other services suffer from the same overclassification, in your opinion?
It's not just a Space Force issue. Other services have similar problems, but it's really a big deal for the Space Force because since the 1950s, space has been a very highly classified realm of operations, and for good reason. But now that we're in a warfighting domain situation where you have to have a credible deterrent and that requires communication of capability, we need to change things a little bit to make it more effective.
And what about when we're working with allies and with international partners? How does the classification system work when you're trying to share information, even among services within our own country?
Well, there are special ways that we work with our allies on that. We have releasable 5As for the main allies. We have releasable to Australia. We have all these different RELs, as we call it. That, in some ways, is a little bit is challenging as well. But if it's important enough to our leadership in the government, we usually can make that happen with our allies. It's when you get to public release that becomes even more challenging.
All right. Well, Chris, thanks so much. We appreciate you coming in.
Thank you very much.